On the next episode of Footnote, we discuss the book Ballers of the New School. Author Thabiti Lewis uses American sports culture to challenge and explore notions of race in America.
It's an attempt to really force us to look at how the dynamics of race function within our society. And sport is the vehicle in which to engage some of these narratives.
It's all coming up on the next episode of Footnote.
Welcome to Footnote and the A&T Bookstore in Clifton, New Jersey. I'm your host, Kimberly Austin. Thabiti Lewis joins us today, and we'll be discussing his new book, Ballers of the New School. Welcome, Thabiti.
Thank you. It is a tremendous pleasure to be here with you today.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, tell us about your book. What's it about?
Ballers of the New School is a book that I've always wanted to read, and I've read a number that were like it. But this book deals with issues of race and sport in American culture. It's an attempt to really force us to look at how the dynamics of race function within our society. And sport is the vehicle in which to engage, because we see sport culture historically as this sort of normalizing agent, this area where racial progress, tremendous, more than we give more credit than perhaps should be the case regarding racial progress in sport culture than perhaps is the case. And I said, well, let me just write a book that says, well, let's look at some of these narratives and attempt to tread back through them and see what does it tell us about the society we live in, particularly in an era where people are quick to talk about we're post-raced. So. Right,
and what does the title mean? Who are these new ballers that you're referring to?
Ballers of the New School. I really pull from sort of hip-hop culture language of, you know, people being a baller, which is someone who is living fabulously and in control of their environment or making something out of nothing, and said, well, let me seize upon this particular language. Number one, to draw people in, but number two, to be instructive and challenge and say, well, a real baller is someone that is willing to push for issues of racial equity, deal with social and economic inequities, and to challenge the historical racial contract that exists in our society for real progress. And so a baller is someone that in my estimation, or as I attempt to articulate this in the book, who's willing to really push and use that status or their positionality to really push for sort of a racial progress that we can that can allow us to go from, instead of talking about post-race, but post-racism. And so I'm challenging athletes, but also a baller can be myself. It can be you. It can be a person that's willing to find a way, not necessarily following norms, but really being courageous, if you will.
But the word baller right now is more stuck in that I got a great car, I got a lot of ladies.
Right. And I'm challenging that. I'm playing with the language of that so I get people's attention. I think that this generation lacks the political acumen that the previous generation does. Take, for example, Michael Jordan, and I talk about him in two phases. On one, the early Michael Jordan, hip-hop swagger, I'm going to do things my own way kind of figure. Nike brings in Spike Lee to direct the early commercials. They're making these connections to this sort of b-boy generation. He's got shoes that are, you know, breaking the codes of the NBA, and so he becomes this sort of icon. And then I think in Nike itself, I even talk about having a bit of baller status. So even, you know, even its founder and going against the grain, no one has ever given athletes this kind of money. But then they reach a point in the marketplace where they say, wait a minute, we want to reach a wider audience, and so we need to construct our product, which is him, in a different kind of way and make them very race neutral. And so this is where the hitch is. And I said, well, wait a minute. Look at how all these athletes, particularly the most popular ones are Tiger Woods, etc., are situated to be these sort of race neutral figures. We don't ask Brett Favre to be race neutral. We don't ask Peyton Manning to be race neutral. We don't ask these those figures to do it. So I said, you know, there's this sort of double standard. There's this sort of racial contract that exists that says there's acceptance on this level and not on another.
And this is a personal challenge for you as well. There's a letter that you write to your nephew at the beginning of the book. Is that what inspired the book?
No, but it was something that was necessary. Was certainly the inspiration to writing the book itself. But the letter itself really came from a circumstance with my younger cousin and him, who's a really brilliant kid who kind of turned away and thought sport is the upward mobility path, et cetera, et cetera. And as I was really laying my heart out to him, I was really thinking about this is really a huge problem. I'm really bothered by the anti-intellectualism that I think exists in our society, and particularly in communities of color, immigrant communities. Education, I mean, period, everyone. Education is the key to trying to move to the next level. And so masculinity has been positioned in some really skewed ways, where being hip, cool, not intelligent is what represents masculinity. And, you know, I wanted to respond to that.
Right, and when we come back, actually, we'll talk more about that dialogue and where race relations are now in sports. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our chat with author Thabiti Lewis, and his book is called Ballers of the New School, Race and Sports in America. Thabiti, who are some of the original ballers?
Original ballers, let me name a few. Jack Johnson, Curt Flood, Bill Russell, Althea Gibson. I think earlier I was chatting a little bit about people like Billie Jean King. You know, these are really important figures because they pave ways. They're trying to make the world better. They're using their status to create gender equity, racial equity, and really changing the way in which our society moves forward, which is one of the reasons why you know, I write this book really as and talk particularly about these original ballers as a reminder, my subtle kind of reminder to this current generation of athletes that, you know, hey, look, number one, whatever you're doing, it's not something new, but also look back and maybe see what this real true spirit is. Of course, how can I leave out Muhammad Ali, right? So let me start with a few that I really like, if you will. So, you know, Muhammad Ali is a guy who certainly wins a gold medal in the Olympics, you know, gets rid of it because of his sentiments regarding when he returns home, how he's treated, you know, back in the South. You know, that's a huge statement. He becomes a member of the Nation of Islam when, in fact, it's not popular. And even despite this, he basically sacrifices his most productive period during his boxing career when he's, you know, perhaps at his best. And so what people forget is that he was pretty much hated by as much of the country that embraced him, you know, during this particular time. He was not afraid to speak out regarding Jim Crow America, social inequities, and he used that particular platform and the time period to really help make a difference in society. Curt Flood is another original baller because this is the person that is the reason that the free agency exists. To players being able to demand higher salaries and pick the teams that they want to go to. Because he'd been with the Cardinals for a number of years. And so his thing was, I'm not a slave. He was very intelligent. He was a Renaissance man. He did art. He's an intellectual. And it breaks him. Althea Gibson, you know, she paves the way for black women in tennis, endures all kind of humiliating, you know, like physical examinations to see if she's a man or not, and you know, eventually she stands her ground and she breaks through. And of course, I love Billie Jean King because she really paves the way for sort of equity of women in sport. Right. And Serena Williams talks about, and not Serena, Venus talks about the influence of Billie in that particular way, and which is one of the reasons why she makes this demand. I'm talking about this is an example of a new school baller being influenced by an original baller to say women should make the same amount as men. And she gets Wimbledon to pay women the same as men, which should be the case. It's incredible
what the purse is now, even for the U.S. Open as well.
That's right.
How far it's come for women. And you think now, you start to see guys dominating the sports and women too, and people of color, and you think that we're moving beyond this, that we're losing the idea of racial inferiority, and yet it's still boiling underneath there. Is that one of the reasons that you chose sports as a vehicle for this commentary?
Yeah, as a kid, my father got me interested in sport, and he would always tell these stories about his adventures. And so my brother and I, we started watching sport. I'm seeing one thing, but I'm hearing something else. And so you're right, on one level, sport has functioned historically as this sort of leveling mechanism. This Jack Johnson, early on becoming the first black heavyweight champion, and really kind of engaging this question of, okay, not cowardly, blah, blah, blah. What does it mean to be heavyweight champion, right? Number one, when people see these figures everywhere, you go, okay, what are you talking about?
Right.
We have this. We have this sort of equity. There's presence, but it's minute, and it's also narrow because it's athletes. But what we also forget is that they're very much constructed. They are, many of them, since 14 or 15, are separate, pretty much pulled out of their communities, and I don't think there's a real connection. And there's not this sort of real kind of consciousness, political acumen, social, intellectual, I think, development, partly because of the business of sport, from high school to collegiate and beyond.
And we're going to continue that dialogue when we come back and continue the discussion on endorsements and where do women stand in this discussion. We'll be right back. We're continuing our chat with author Thabiti Lewis, and his book is called Ballers of the New School, Race and Sports in America. Thabiti, why is it that we see more black-dominated sports with football and basketball and a wider white presence in sports like swimming or even NASCAR racing?
I think there are a couple of factors. Number one, I think that basketball and football have grown in such immense popularity in our society over the last few decades. Their equipment and space are huge issues as well, right? When I think about sport, I have two daughters, and they're involved in the very sport that you're talking about. Why aren't they involved, right? I mean, my one daughter, they play soccer, and you have to buy all this equipment and these things. They ice skate, and ice skating is expensive because every lesson costs. Tennis, you have to be you'd like to be a member of a club so you can play. So all these things. So there's a certain social, economic factors that tie into it. I think football and basketball have really grown in popularity also in our society. And basketball is something that if you just have the shoes that you wear to school, you can participate. You don't have to own a ball. Football, you have this kind of equipment stuff, but even that you can play without it. And so these seem to be the sport that they're drawn to. Now, once they get in it, there's a lot of stacking that takes place regarding who's going, particularly football, who's going to play what particular positions. Sort of quarterback is off limits of non-white players, although we see more today.
Absolutely, there's a lot more. But we're not seeing a great shift in the leadership positions in sports.
No.
Why is that?
Well, back to the racial contract, right? This idea of, racial supremacy, who is a leader, privilege of, and intellect, and where that is directed. And so when you think about quarterbacks, even when there are black quarterbacks, just the double standards that exist, the pressures are immense, and the room for error is so small. The number one thing I talk about in my own research, and anyone that knows that there has to be institutional interest and intent and commitment to making those things happen. And so while the NFL instituted the Rooney Rule, I will here go on record to say that I think Tony Dungy has done more to diversify coaching ranks than the Rooney Rule could imagine. One of the biggest problems we have is that we don't often come into the same spaces to get to know each other, to find out that we in fact have more in common than we think we have not in common.
That's right. When you find that common ground, it makes such a difference sometimes. And in fact, that brings me to this question of how do we stop kids from thinking that this career in the NBA or in entertainment or rap music is the end all to be all, and get them back toward what we were speaking about earlier with education and becoming a doctor or a lawyer or a school teacher, which are respectable and wonderful careers.
You know, it's funny because when I was in college, you were cool if you could talk about all the books that you'd read, if you could quote Fanon, if you could if you could go through the litany of your understanding of communism or capitalism and world economic systems, and women would be like, oh, he's kind of smart. But now you're right, that has lost its cachet, if you will. There doesn't seem to be a real interest in intellectualism, as you pointed out. And part of my book is a response to the anti-intellectualism that exists in our society. But I think that there are organizations that are doing, like I think in New York, I've been making connections with some of the writings that I've been doing with, someone runs an organization called Yes Incorporated that says we're going to use sport to get kids to understand, and we're going to channel that through sport and make athletes the top sort of academic and intellectual leaders, those that are interested, and it will become the model, because athletes are kind of heroes, even on every level, that people look up to, and if the athletes are cool, then it becomes cool. You see what I'm saying? And so I think it will take effort, but I mean it will take concerted effort to work with organizations that are doing these kind of things and trying to make it visible to people, and getting them to work together.
Well, you mentioned the college graduation rates. In fact, we'll talk more about that when we come back, and also the commercialism in college sports. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our chat with author Thabiti Lewis. Thabiti, I really want to touch on college sports because, let's be honest, this is a multi-million-dollar industry, and it really seems like education is the smallest part of it. How is the state of the sport today? And you actually make a very interesting point in your book that these kids should probably get paid a salary on top of any scholarships that they might receive.
Yeah, you're one correction. Billion.
I wasn't sure. I had a feeling.
Multi-billion-dollar industry, as you point out, and yes, I do think they should get paid. The NCAA just signed a $10.8 billion deal with a cable station and a CBS just for the tournament over the next number of years, and so that's just one component. We're not talking about the bowl game revenue per university and the paraphernalia and the TV,
coaches' salaries and bonuses,
TV rights, the money that the coaches and the universities make for having these kids wear the the apparel of different companies. And so if we're meritocracy, and if they're putting in so much time each week. I was reading an article in the paper prior to the Oregon team playing Oregon State to go to national champ. The coach made a comment, we're going to go to 3-a-days. And I was thinking, as a college professor, this is finals week coming up. How do you do 3-a-days? I mean,
and have time for academics.
And have time for academics, class, labs, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a real conflict of interest. Players aren't being allowed to really pursue a collegiate experience. And I mean, you went to college. I went to college. You remember what you did when you were in college, right? You remember some of the free time to just think, reflect, meet people. Right. They're sort of isolated, and maybe they can't take lab courses, those kind of things, and that's problematic for me. They're
there to do a job.
They're there to do a job, and those people that do a job well should be paid. organs coach, I think, got like a $4 million bonus or a new contract. So certainly there's some money to divvy up based on the success of the team.
And if we take it back a step further too, high school kids, there are over 2 million kids playing sports in high school, but only 1% of them will ever make it to professional sports.
That's right, yeah. In a letter to my cousin, I'm kind of doing this true-false thing, and I'm just laying out what is known, but I try and find a unique way of saying true, false, true, false, you know, but it's so small that you have a greater chance of becoming, like myself, a literature professor, yourself, someone involved in journalism, broadcast, a doctor. Those opportunities are more accessible than making it and thriving, even if you make it in professional sport.
I think 20, 30 years ago, the people that we were looking up to were smart, and that's what we admired about them, was their intellect.
Yeah.
So how do we turn that tide back?
Well, again, I'm hoping that more young people will read books like this, that people engage in, I mean, it's going to take real work and effort in communities and in schools, and as we get a more, and pushing for a more educated, a more intellectual athlete, that their presence exudes intellectualism. And so what they see is not just that person scoring baskets, running touchdowns, but they hear a very intelligent and articulate figure. America is got to get away from anti-intellectualism, and that, you know, masculinity, particularly for, I think, young men, I don't care what their ethnicity or race is, masculinity is not situated in merely the physical, but it is the whole person, the real man, and that is the intellectual side, the philosophical side.
And how's your cousin doing now?
My cousin, who, you know, was floundering at that time, is now a graduate student in engineering. He was always brilliant, and you know, he reversed the track, and so he does reflect this sort of, you know, model that you can be involved in athletics, but it's very important to develop the intellectual self, you know. That
integration that you spoke of earlier.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thabiti, it was so nice to meet you today.
It was a pleasure. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Although sport is often presented as the model of success to many young kids, it often remains a mindless escape. As Thabiti says, we have to blend the mind and the intellect to something purely physical to really make it a site of resistance. Thank you for being with us today. I hope you'll join us again next time on Footnote.